The litter wanted to go downhill. That is the only way I know to say it. We were on the steep switchback section, roughly 4 miles in, 400 feet of gain left ahead of us, and the trail had turned to loose shale over packed clay, and the front end of that litter was trying to slide back toward me every time Ruiz took a step. I had my hands locked under the frame rail, and my boots were cutting sideways into the slope, and I was doing the math in the back of my mind, the way you do when your body already knows the answer before your head does. 280 pounds of patient and litter. 2 men. One of them, a 26-year-old with good arms and no back injury, and still struggling. And then the weight changed. Not all at once. It shifted the way weight shifts when a third person steps in on a carry, a smooth and deliberate redistribution that runs up the frame and settles into a new balance. I felt it in my hands first, then in my knees because my knees stopped shaking. Ruiz must have felt it too because he looked back at me over the patient's covered form, and I could see his eyes asking a question he did not have breath to voice. I shook my head because I did not have an answer. To explain what happened on that switchback, I need to go back about 2 years, maybe a little more. Vance Dillard died on a Tuesday in September, which is the kind of specific detail that does not stop being specific, no matter how much time passes. He was my senior partner on a county EMS unit out of a small station in the foothills east of the range, and he had worked that station for 19 years before I arrived, and another 11 after I did. He was 61 years old, and he had a heart that had been quietly building a wall across its own plumbing for probably a decade before anyone knew. And on that Tuesday in September, he went down in the parking lot of a convenience store while we were restocking the cooler on a water run between calls. I was inside paying. I was inside paying because I had offered to cover it, because Vance had bought the last 2 rounds, and I was at the counter, and I heard the sound his keys made when they hit the asphalt, and I did not go out immediately. I finished the transaction. I took my change. Those are the facts as I know them, and as I have carried them. By the time I got to him, he was already past the window where the outcome could have been different. The cardiologist told me that later, told me it plainly and without cruelty because he was the kind of doctor who understood that plainness is a form of mercy. He said the window was 3 to 4 minutes and that I could not have known. I heard him say it. I just did not believe it the way you believe something that actually settles. Vance left behind a wife named Loretta, a good garden, and a ritual that I did not find out about until the week after the funeral, when Loretta sat me down at her kitchen table and told me about it, because she thought I should know. Every time Vance camped in the backcountry, every time he was on an overnight shift at a remote station, he would set out a square of cornbread on a flat rock at the edge of camp before he turned in. He had done it for 30 years. He said he did it because his grandmother had told him the woods like to be fed, and he had never once found a reason to disbelieve her. Loretta said she used to tease him about it. She said, by the end, she had stopped teasing him. She said the cornbread was always gone in the morning and he always slept well, and that was good enough for her. I started doing it myself. I do not have a clean explanation for that. I am not a superstitious man, and I was not trying to become one. I think I just needed something of his to carry that was not grief, and the ritual was small enough to fit in a coat pocket. I started keeping a foil-wrapped square in my camp kit the same week Loretta told me the story. I have not stopped since. My brother Cal and I had not spoken in 2 years by the time the carry came around. The estrangement was my fault in the way that silences are usually one person's fault, which is to say it was less about one event and more about a long accumulation of not answering calls, not returning the messages he left on days when he must have known I needed someone. And finally, a Thanksgiving where I simply did not show up and did not call until 4 days later. And by then, the particular texture of that silence had hardened into something neither of us knew how to address. Cal is 3 years younger than me, and he became a high school shop teacher in a small town in eastern Washington. And he is better at being a person in the world than I have ever been. And I suspect that was part of the problem. It is easier to avoid the people who are doing it right. I left full-time EMS 8 months after Vance died. I told myself it was for the better hours, and I told myself it was for the physical work, which I missed. And both of those things had some truth in them. What also had truth in it, and what I did not say to anyone at the time, was that I could not get back in that unit without smelling the specific combination of vinyl and antiseptic that had been the texture of every shift I had worked alongside him, and that smell was doing something to my ability to function that I did not have a word for and did not want to develop one. I took seasonal wildland firework instead. I got on a hand crew working fire lines in the Okanogan that first summer, and then the Methau the next, and the physical exhaustion was clean and total, and it did not require me to think about parking lots or convenience stores, or the sound keys make on asphalt. I kept my EMT certification current because that is what you do. You keep the certification current and you tell yourself you might go back, and you do not go back. The call for volunteers on the litter carry came in through the county SAR coordinator in late September. An experienced hiker with a fractured tibia, 6 miles in on a trail in the northern Cascades. Elevation too low for a helicopter approach with the cloud ceiling sitting where it was. They needed bodies for a carry, experienced bodies, and they were short. I said yes before I had finished reading the message, which is the kind of decision the body makes before the mind can object. I drove up the night before with Pepper in the back of the truck and made camp at the trailhead. Pepper is a cattle dog, black and tan, and she was 12 that October, which is old for a working dog, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of an animal that has learned to conserve. She had been Vance's dog first, technically. He had given her to me as a 3-year-old when his allergies got the better of him, and Loretta issued what she called her final ruling on indoor animals, and Pepper had transferred her loyalty to me with a completeness that still made me feel I had gotten more than I deserved. That night, I set out the cornbread square on the flat granite slab at the edge of camp. Pepper watched me do it from her spot at the tent door, her chin on her front paws, her eyes following my hands the way she always watched that particular act, patient and unhurried. The October dark came down early and hard. I could hear the creek below the camp and the wind moving through the fir canopy overhead, and there was a smell in the air that I could not immediately name, cool and green and deep, the kind of smell that lives in drainages where the sun does not reach until mid-morning. I zipped the tent and lay still, and did not sleep well, and did not expect to. Ruiz was waiting at the trailhead at first light. He was from the county SAR team, 20s, with the look of someone who ran trails recreationally and knew how to carry weight, and he greeted me with a nod and the kind of practical conversation that means we are going to get along fine because neither of us needs to perform anything. He had the litter staged, already fitted with the wheel attachment for the lower trail sections, and we went over the carry plan and the patient's vitals summary from the field team and the terrain report, and by 6:30 we were moving. The first 3 miles were straightforward. The trail was good, wide enough for the litter with the wheel running, and Ruiz and I found a rhythm quickly. The patient was a man in his late 40s named Jim, conscious and calm, in the way that people become calm when the adrenaline has worn off, and the pain management has done its work, and he apologized to us twice in the first mile. I told him to save his energy, which is what you say. He saved it. Pepper walked alongside the litter on my left, off-leash, as she had been trained to do on any backcountry carry. She was not a certified SAR dog, but she had been on enough of these that she understood the pace and the purpose, and she was reliable. She checked in with me every 100 yards or so, a quick glance, then forward again. If you have spent time on mountain trails in October, you know the particular quality of the morning light in a mixed conifer drainage when the season has just tipped. The larches had gone gold above us, and the light came through them at a low angle and made everything look like the last good version of itself before the grey moved in. I noticed it the way you notice things when you are working hard, and the work is keeping your attention mostly, but not completely, occupied. There is a part of the mind that stays loose, watching for things that are not the task. It was around the 4-mile mark that the birds stopped. I want to be precise about that because it matters, and because I have replayed it many times. The trail corridor had been carrying normal morning bird noise, the typical late-season mix of jays and nuthatches, and the occasional kinglet moving through the understory. And then that noise was gone. Not faded. Gone. The way sound goes when something large has moved through an area, and everything small has made a collective decision. So I noticed it and logged it in the back of my mind and kept moving, because on a carry, you do not stop for bird noise. Pepper noticed it before I named it. Her ears had gone forward and her pace had slowed to the careful side-to-side scan that she used when she was reading a scent she had not categorized. She did not growl. She did not tuck her tail. She just became more present, the way animals do when they are paying attention to a specific thing, rather than to everything generally. I watched her for a count of about 15 steps. She settled. Her ears stayed forward, but her pace came back to normal, and she checked in with me the way she always did. I told myself it was a bear moving through above the trail. The wind was downslope, and we were making enough noise with the litter wheel on the rock surface that anything sensible would have moved off before we got close. That was a reasonable explanation. I held it for about a 1/4 mile. Then I smelled it. I have spent enough seasons in deep timber to know what the woods smell like when something large is nearby. Most of the time that smell is musk, identifiable, classifiable, elk or bear, or the specific waxy note of a cougar that has been on a kill. What I smelled was not any of those. It was green and deep and warm in a way that did not match the temperature of the air, and it was directional, coming from the uphill side of the trail, from the tree line above the switchback section we were approaching. I breathed through it and could not place it and filed it without a category. Ruiz did not comment on it. I did not ask if he noticed. We were both working hard by then, and the trail had begun to tighten, and the wheel was no longer running clean, and we had folded it up and were hand-carrying over the rocky section. And that kind of labor does not leave room for much conversation. That is when I saw the limb. It was a fir limb, roughly 6 feet long and as big around as my forearm, and it had been lying across the trail on our approach scout the day before. I had noted it specifically because I had mentally flagged it as a carry obstacle and planned to kick it clear on the way through. It was not there. It was not there, and it had not been thrown aside by wind, because the break point on the trunk was clean, and the ground on either side of the trail was clear of debris, in a way that suggested the limb had been moved with some intention, not blown. I stood looking at that section of trail for longer than I had a right to, given that we were working, and then I looked at Ruiz, and he shrugged in the way you shrug when you have noticed something you cannot explain and have decided not to spend energy on it. We kept moving. You asked what it is like to carry 280 pounds of patient and litter up a switchback trail on a cold October morning with tired legs. I will tell you, it is the kind of work that reduces a person to their most basic mechanical function, which is either a terrible thing or a useful one depending on what you are trying to escape. Every step on the uphill end of that litter means absorbing the full grade differential in your legs and lower back, while your arms are keeping the frame level. Ruiz had the uphill position, which on a long carry is the harder position by a margin that is not subtle, and I could see by the fourth switchback that he was finding the limit of what his good arms and his good training could do on ground this steep. I do not tell this to diminish him. He was working as hard as a person can work. The problem was physics and grade, and those two things were not negotiating. We were on the fifth switchback when I felt the weight change. I described this at the beginning, and I will describe it again because the first time I was trying to place you in the moment before I gave you the context to understand it. Here is what it felt like from inside the work. My hands had the frame rail, and my boots were set sideways on the shale, and I was in the part of a carry where you are negotiating with your own body about whether the next step is available. And then the load redistributed the way load redistributes when a third set of hands takes some of it. Smooth. Deliberate. Not a surge, not a bump, a clean assumption of weight at the head of the litter. The uphill end, where Ruiz was holding on and where I could see his face. And his face showed something I have since tried to name. Not fear. Something past the edge of the categories he had available. Pepper had stopped at the tree line above the trail. She was sitting. Not crouched, not retreating. Sitting with her ears forward and her attention fixed on a point in the dark timber above us, and her tail was moving, slow and low, the way it moved when she was greeting something she had decided was not a threat. I cannot tell you exactly what I saw. I want to be honest about that. What I can tell you is what I registered. A stillness in the dark timber that was the wrong shape for shadow. A mass and a verticality that did not belong to any tree on that slope. And the specific quality of a thing that is aware it is being looked at and has decided to remain anyway. It was large. Whatever I can say past that would be my mind trying to fill in a shape that my eyes did not get enough light to give me, and I am not willing to do that. Ruiz was looking at me. Jim, the patient, had gone very quiet in the litter, in the way people sometimes go quiet when they feel a change in the people carrying them. I held the trail position for about 3 seconds. Then whatever was at the head of the litter let the weight come back down, and my arms took it, and we kept moving. It took us another 40 minutes to clear the steep section. Ruiz and I did not talk during it. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the talking would have cost us the work, and the work was what mattered. Pepper walked ahead of us for the rest of the carry, checking back at intervals, and she did not display the scan and lock behavior again. She moved like an animal who had resolved a question and was now simply going home. The last 2 miles were flatter and went quickly. We handed Jim to the waiting medic unit at the trailhead, and the SAR coordinator shook our hands, and Ruiz and I stood by the rig for a few minutes, with the particular exhaustion that comes after a long carry, when the adrenaline stops and the body does its accounting. Ruiz looked at me once. He said, "That was a weird section." I said yes. He nodded. We left it there. I drove back to the camp alone because I had told Ruiz I needed to break it down and drive out in the morning. That was true. What was also true was that I needed to be still for a while, and I could not do that in a parking lot with other people present. The camp was as I had left it. Tent, pack, the small fire ring with the grey ash of the previous night's fire. Pepper jumped the tailgate and went directly to the flat granite slab at the edge of camp, and put her nose down to the rock surface and held it there for a long moment. The cornbread was gone. I had expected that. Small animals take camp food, squirrels and jays and raccoons, and I had expected the cornbread to be gone the same as it always was, which was the point. What I had not expected were the stones. On the flat granite slab where the cornbread had been, there were 9 stones arranged in a rough pattern. River stones, the kind with the weight and colour of deep water, smooth-sided and rounded, none of them native to that slope, the nearest creek running a 1/4 mile below the camp. They were arranged in a shape that was clearly deliberate, 3 groupings of 3, with a spacing and alignment that no natural process produces. I knew that immediately, the same way you know a level line from a sloped one without needing an instrument. My hands know the difference, and my eyes confirm it. I stood looking at those stones for a long time. Pepper sat beside me, her shoulder warm against my knee, her breathing slow and even. I have carried a lot of things out of other people's hardest moments. You do that long enough, you develop a way of being present with something large without being broken by it. What I felt standing at that rock was not any clinical category of feeling. It was closer to the specific sensation of setting down a load you have been carrying so long, you forgot it was separate from you. Something behind my sternum went quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 2 years. I do not know what that arrangement meant. I do not know what anything about that night means in any final categorical sense. And I want to be clear that I am not trying to explain it. What I know is that Vance had fed something in those woods for 30 years, and something had taken the feeding seriously. And that night, it gave something back. Whether that is a reasonable thing to believe is not a question I am still asking. The stones were real. I have them on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. I broke camp in the morning and drove out on the logging road as the light was coming up pale and flat through the eastern timber. Pepper was asleep in the back, curled in her blanket, and the radio was off, and I drove for about an hour before I pulled into the gravel turnaround above a river bridge and picked up my phone. I want to tell you, I had a speech prepared. I had nothing. I dialed Cal's number, and when he picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice had the specific, careful quality of a person who has answered a call they were not sure they would get to answer, and has not yet decided what to do with that. He said my name. That is all he said. I said, I know it's been a while. He said, yeah. I said, I should have called sooner. I should have called a lot sooner. I'm not going to make that make sense right now. I stopped there because the next sentence was not available. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. He let me have the silence. After a moment, he said, Are you okay? I said, I think I'm getting there. He said, That's enough. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about everything. Not about Vance and not about the particulars of the 2 years of quiet, but around the edges of it. The way you talk around something when you both know it is there and have agreed that today is the day you start acknowledging it, even if you are not ready to look at it straight on. He told me about the shop class, a lathe project his students had been working on, the specific mechanical details he knew I would want to hear. I told him about the carry and the terrain, not about the rest of it, just the carry and the weight and the trail. He said it sounded hard. I said it was. I said it was worth it. I had not said that about a call in 2 years. I noticed that I meant it. That winter was long the way winters in that part of the country are always long. The light going grey in October and not coming back until March. And I worked a desk job with the county emergency management office that kept me useful without putting me back in a unit. And I went to see Cal in February for a long weekend, the first visit in more years than I want to count, and we built a short section of fence on his property that needed doing and did not say much that was not about the fence, and that was the right amount. Cal's wife, a small, direct woman named Greta, made soup both evenings and did not press me on anything, and I was grateful to her in a way I did not fully express, but I think she knew. By March, I had started talking to the county coordinator about going back on the EMT roster. Not full-time. Volunteer, the way I had been for the litter carry. I told him I was not ready for the unit yet. He said he understood. He said there was no schedule. I said I would let him know when the schedule changed. The following April, I took Pepper back to that trailhead. She was 13 by then, and the arthritis in her hips had gotten enough that I brought the truck close and lifted her down easy from the tailgate, rather than letting her jump. And she stood on the gravel and turned her nose into the wind the way she had always done at the start of a trail, running the air through whatever accounting system a dog uses. The larches were still bare that high. The snow had pulled back from the trail to about the 3-mile mark, and I was not going further than the snow anyway. I just wanted to walk the lower section. I wanted to walk it in spring in the morning, with the creek running high and the air carrying the green and dirt smell of snowmelt, and Pepper moving at my left knee, the way she had moved at my left knee for 10 years. She stopped at the first flat granite slab we came to, about a mile in, not the camp rock, but a similar one, wide and grey and cold in the shade of the firs. She put her nose down the way she had put it down at camp that October night, patient and slow, reading whatever was there to read. I sat on a log at the edge of the trail and watched her do it. I do not go back to the parking lot in my head as often as I did. It is there when I reach for it, the specific sequence of sounds and choices, but it does not reach for me the way it used to. Not in the dark at 2 in the morning, not in the particular silence after a hard call. I have not made peace with what happened in any way that would satisfy a careful person's definition of peace. What I have done is carry it differently, the weight redistributed the same way the litter weight was redistributed on that switchback, not removed but shared with something larger than my own accounting. I still put out the cornbread. Every time I camp, every time I'm out overnight, I set the square on a flat rock at the edge of camp, and Pepper watches me do it, and in the morning, it is gone. I have not seen anything at the camp rock since that October night. I have not expected to. I think the exchange was complete. Whatever was in that dark timber above the switchback, whatever moved that limb and lifted the head of the litter and sat with deliberate and enormous patience while I looked at the wrong shape in the shadows, I cannot tell you what it was. I have not tried to tell many people. The ones I have told nod in a particular way, and I understand the nod completely, because it is the same nod I would have given 2 years ago, and I do not hold it against anyone. A man who spent his life refusing to exaggerate does not have a lot of credibility when he stops refusing. What I know is this. Vance fed something in those woods for 30 years, and it remembered. And when I was on a steep grade in the dark, on my first call since the worst day of my working life, with my legs going and my arms going and the load past what 2 men could carry, it came to the uphill end, and it held. Pepper finished her reading of the flat rock and came back to me and put her head on my knee, and I rested my hand on top of her head, the way I had rested it 1,000 times. The creek was running loud in the drainage below us. A nuthatch was working the fir bark somewhere above, and the morning was opening up pale and clear and cold, and the snow line was a bright white stripe across the upper ridge. And the world had the particular quality it sometimes has in spring when it is showing you what it is going to do before it does it. We sat there for a while, Pepper and I, not going anywhere. The stones are still on the windowsill above my kitchen sink, all 9 of them in their 3 groupings, smooth-sided and rounded, carrying the weight and colour of deep water. I have not moved them. I do not think I will. If you have had a moment out there that you have carried alone because you did not know how to put it into words without losing something, the next story is waiting for you on screen.